You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society.
My name is Sherry Schock.
And my name is Bob Schock.
And now, here's the host of Lighthearted, Jeremy D'Entremont.
Welcome, and happy 4th of July. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there. Happy 4th of July.
Today's subject is a lighthouse that's one of my favorites, and I know a lot of other people feel that way about it too. We'll be talking with Brian Tefft, the executive director of the Rose Island Lighthouse and Fort Hamilton Trust in Newport, Rhode Island. I want to thank today's special guest announcers, Sherry and Bob Schock of Pennsylvania. They're regular listeners, and I really appreciate their support. Anyone who would like to be a guest announcer on a future episode should contact me at jeremy@uslhs.org. This is episode 126 of Lighthearted, and this is July 4th, 2021. Of course, we all know that something very important for this country happened on July 4th, 1776. But what has happened on this date in lighthouse history, Michelle?
On July 4th, 1882, Standard Rock Lighthouse on Lake Superior in Michigan was first lighted. It took 5 years and $300,000 to build the tower, which is 10 miles from the nearest shore. It's constructed of sandstone blocks weighing 12 to 30 tons each. Standard Rock originally had a second-order Fresnel lens, and the light could be seen for about 25 miles. Today, the lighthouse is being restored for use as a climate research station by the Superior Watershed Partnership and Land Conservancy.
On July 4th, 1927, the American playwright Neil Simon was born in the Bronx, New York. He once said, quote, "I love living. I have some problems with my life, but living is the best thing they've come up with so far," unquote. So let's talk about our main subject today, Rose Island Lighthouse.
18-acre Rose Island, about a mile offshore from Newport, Rhode Island, has a commanding position in Narragansett Bay's East Passage. The waters around Newport were busy with passenger steamers, fishing boats, and freighters in the mid-19th century.
The southwest corner of Rose Island was an ideal place for a light to help guide navigators passing through the East Passage of the bay. On July 20th, 1868, Congress appropriated $7,500 for a lighthouse, and the site chosen was a surviving bastion of 18th-century Fort Hamilton.
The lighthouse is 35 feet tall, with its focal plane 48 feet above the water. The octagonal lighthouse tower rises from the west side of the mansard roof on top of the handsome 1 1/2 story wooden keeper's dwelling.
The lighthouse went into service on January 20th, 1870, with a 6th-order Fresnel lens exhibiting a fixed red light. A fog bell tower and striking apparatus were added to the station in 1885, with the bell striking a double blow every 15 seconds.
The majority of the island, formerly used for military purposes, was declared surplus after World War II. The light lost its importance as a navigational aid with the construction of the Newport Bridge in 1969. The island was sold to a group of local businessmen who, in the 1980s, proposed to build a 125-unit condominium complex and a 200-slip marina.
In the 1980s, a group of dedicated preservationists founded the Rose Island Lighthouse Foundation to protect the historic structure. In 1985, the Rose Island Lighthouse Foundation began the process of restoring the building inside and out. The lighthouse has been restored to the 1912 to 1915 period.
In 1992, the lighthouse was opened to the public, and on August 7, 1993, it was relighted as a private aid to navigation. You can now stay overnight at Rose Island for a taste of Lighthouse Service life. You can stay in the restored downstairs rooms or in the upstairs apartment.
In recent years, much restoration has been completed, including the installation of a replica 6th-order Fresnel lens. Rose Island Lighthouse is also open for tours to schools and other groups.
The Rose Island Lighthouse Foundation recently changed its name to the Rose Island Lighthouse and Fort Hamilton Trust, also known as RIFH Trust. Brian Tefft is the executive director of the trust. Brian is also a biologist with extensive experience with natural resource management, wetlands, environmental policy, and education.
I spoke with Brian Tefft recently. Let's listen to that now. I'm speaking today with Brian Tefft, and Brian is the Executive Director of the Rose Island Lighthouse and Fort Hamilton Trust in Newport, Rhode Island. Thanks so much for joining me, Brian.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Rose Island is a place that's very near and dear to me. Maybe I could say a little bit more about that. I have a history with it, but it's a special place. It's a beautiful place, as I'm sure some of our listeners are well aware. I'm just curious, what led you to become the executive director for the RIFH Trust?
Well, this is sort of a second career for me. I spent my life working for the Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island. I was a wildlife biologist there and worked in the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And the work there involves a lot of variety involving the restoration and management of all the wildlife within the state, everything from the hunted species to the non-hunted species, birds, mammals, fish, invertebrates, everything really. I specialized in the terrestrial side and the wildlife side. So I spent a fair amount of time in my responsibilities managing habitats for the benefit of species, restoring habitats and managing them to meet the needs of those wildlife. And I also spent a fair amount of time doing some research and survey on different species. I tended to specialize in deer management and wild turkey restoration. I spent a lot of time restoring the wild turkey to Rhode Island. It was sort of a important part of our wildlife management program, making sure that species could be restored. This was a bird that had been extincted from the state back in probably the late 1700s. Wow. But across the country, it's a popular restoration program to bring the native wildlife back. So I worked in that. And in 2017, I got to the end of the road there and I retired from the state after 32 and a half years and decided that, I needed something else to do. So I was looking around and I saw that there was an advertisement in a local job posting for a tour guide on Rose Island. Of course, I had been to Rose Island a couple of times professionally, looking at the wildlife there and doing some surveys, and had been there also privately with my family. So I knew of the lighthouse. I knew the sustainability and all the restoration efforts that had gone on there. So I applied and I got the job. So I was working part-time. I was working at that point, maybe anywhere between 10 and 15 hours a week, greeting guests and doing stuff like that. I actually offered to help with the maintenance because there was only one guy there at the time. And there's a lot to do, as you know. You've been there. So there's a lot of stuff to do there. Sure. In the summertime, the guests are coming and going, and it doesn't leave a lot of time for one guy to do grass mowing and painting and repair work and stuff like that. So I started to do a little bit of that. And by the end of that year, they were looking for a backup captain. They only had one captain working for them. So I ended up going forward and got my captain's license so I could operate the boat. Okay. We have a 32-foot lobster boat, the Starfish, that takes our guests in and out of the facility. So I obtained my captain's license, a master license with the Coast Guard, and became able to run the boat. And throughout the next year, it continued on that way. But the property manager basically left the job, and that opened at kind of a critical time. They needed help right away, so I stepped in and took over those duties. And within a few months, I became the executive director because the current director left the job. So it was a pretty, I wasn't really looking for it. I was looking to stay part-time, but it found me. And I have good land management, organizational skills. So it just happened. It just happened. So I became full-time there in August of 2018. And so 2019 was a busy year. It was first year that I was director, full year anyways. Very successful year. We had a lot of great projects. We made significant improvements. Our infrastructure had suffered just over the years. I mean, everything is so expensive. Everything from the solar power, because we're off grid, to the cistern, to the generator, to the house itself. I mean, repairs are constant. Something is always broken. I took over that, in a pretty aggressive way to try to straighten things out. And it's been good. But then 2020 hit, causing the pandemic. So that was another challenge, just maintaining the place without any income, because we survive on the income of our overnight stays and tour groups and things like that. But we lost an entire year of income. In fact, in 2020, our income revenue stream declined by 72%. So we had very, very little to work with. That's how I came to be there, and I'm continuing in that role for the time being, and we'll see the improvements that we've made. I think are really significant along the way, and hopefully we can get into some of those things, that some of the changes that have happened on the island. One of the big changes was the name, and the reason why we changed our name was that Rose Island is a lot more than just the lighthouse. I mean, the lighthouse is really cool. Yep. But we have two places there that are on the National Register of Historic Places, both Fort Hamilton and the lighthouse. With the assistance of the Department of Agriculture, I was able to get some funding to manage a lot of the vegetation, which again is kind of my specialty. So there's been some good improvements. So we can talk about that. I don't want to ramble too much.
Yeah. No, there's so many components to it. You know, it is a very historic place, but, you know, even aside from the lighthouse, and we'll talk a bit about Fort Hamilton as well. Yep. But so you had a great background in biology and wildlife, as you said, which would certainly be useful at Rose Island. There's that's a big component of the place there, the natural environment and the wildlife, all kinds of birds and so forth, especially. But I'm wondering, before you said you worked as a tour guide first at Rose Island, so you obviously had an interest in that specific place, but were lighthouses kind of an interest of yours before?
I've always been interested in lighthouses. I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with them, because I know there are people that are obsessed with lighthouses. That we see lots of them.
I know a lot of them.
I had just an interest in them, and they're certainly interesting places. They're historically beautiful. I mean, I've been to several of the ones in Rhode Island, and the southeast one comes to mind, Point Judith, Westerly. I mean, they're all so iconic. So that's really where my interest was.
Oh, Rhode Island's got a great group of lighthouses, of course, mostly are in and around Narragansett Bay.
Right.
A lot of our listeners are well aware of that. Why is Rose Island especially important to the Newport area, do you think?
Well, Rose Island is instrumental in the location that it sits. I mean, it sits at the outer skirts of the harbor on the entrance to the Narragansett Bay. So its location is significant in that it's so close yet so far, I guess would be the way I say it. Newport's a pretty busy little city. In the summertime, the population swells with all the incoming guests and residents, combined with all the tourism that goes on there. I mean, it's a popular tourism place. But yet you could be out on Rose Island and none of that really seems to matter. You've been there, so you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
You're so close yet so far. You can look at it, and but yet it's so peaceful out there on any given day during the summertime. That's kind of really an interesting place as far as that goes. And then, of course, Newport history is just so fantastic because, it dates back to an important time during the country's formation, during the Revolutionary War. Newport was the center of government in the state of Rhode Island for many, many years. A very important place. And state capital, states of government was there following that. So it's really an important place in that regard.
It was one of our most important ports in early America.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I've discovered recently that, the Navy, of course, has been in Newport forever and ever. And really, it's the Civil War, which is why the Navy is in Newport. Annapolis being the center of Navy's infrastructure historically during the Civil War, they were concerned about the Confederacy overtaking it. And so they established the second port in Newport in the 1860s. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be such a fantastic place that the admirals in charge said, we need to stay here. So they established the Newport Navy base, and the Naval War College is still in Newport today.
Yeah, well, it's a great legacy in so many ways. All kinds of maritime and naval things there in Newport. Right. So you mentioned the fort a few minutes ago, Fort Hamilton. So could you just tell maybe a bit about the history of Fort Hamilton? What makes that so important?
Rose Island was a fortification even before Fort Hamilton. So it's because of its strategic location. I mean, it faces within, say 2 miles, the entrance from the Atlantic Ocean into Narragansett Bay. Mm-hmm. So you got the sweeping arm of Aquidneck Island coming around, and then you've got the Jamestown, Connecticut Island on the west side. And so this narrow gap comes through, and when you pop through that gap, you're right in Newport Harbor. And so Rose Island faces that opening, and strategically, it's an important place to put guns if you were trying to protect your assets. Yeah. Of course, on the Aquidneck Island end is Fort Adams, which named after President Adams, I'm sure, of John Adams. Fort Hamilton after Alexander Hamilton. And then on Rhode Island, we had Fort George. So there were these three forts strategically located that were important to Newport protection.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1798, the government commenced the construction of Fort Hamilton on Rose Island. And they constructed a barracks. They constructed curtain walls, a north, a south, an east, and a west curtain wall, and two tower bastions on the southwest and northwest corners of the fort. And these were designed by a French major general who was an engineer named Toussard. He was instrumental in designing many of the early U.S. forts.
Yeah.
Henri Toussard was his full name. And the reason being the new U.S. government was knowledgeable of the French. They had collaborated with the French during the Revolutionary War. And their engineering skills at building forts was superior to the U.S. He was encouraged to join and then started building these forts. Many of the early forts in the country were designed by this fellow. Between 1798 and say the War of 1812, there was a lot of construction that occurred. In fact, when you look at the picture of Rose Island and where it sits, that round wall in front is actually Fort Hamilton. So when they built the lighthouse about 70 years later, they essentially filled in the southwest bastion of Fort Hamilton and built a lighthouse inside of it. Fortunately or unfortunately, Fort Hamilton was never actually armed during that period. There never were any cannons there. There was no garrison of soldiers. They did build a bomb-proof barracks, which still stands to this day. It's what they call the first system fort, which means that it were the first forts developed by the U.S. government. Relatively simple by comparison to Fort Adams, which was rebuilt 3 times. It's a
third system.
Third level fort. Yeah, third system fort. Right, exactly. But still, it might be, if not the only, one of the best remaining examples of a first system fort anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
And so, when we changed our name, it was to accentuate that fact. It's a pretty special place.
Mm-hmm.
And shows what an intact fort would look like at that point in time.
Yeah, I was going to say first system forts are pretty rare. There's not much left.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an official knowledge that is a fact, that it's the one of the only, but I'm sure there's not that many of them left. Fort Hamilton, I mean, existed. The names changed over time. In the middle 1800s, there wasn't a lot of activity there. There were no until the Civil War, when the Navy came to Newport. It wasn't until 1872 that the Navy designated Goat Island as their torpedo station, which, because that Rose Island came into the prominence again in that it was designated as a naval magazine. So that's kind of an interesting fact, that a magazine is a place where explosives are stored. So essentially, the barracks is a 200-foot long building on Rose Island, 200 foot by, say, 60 feet wide. And it has 9 chambers, which are domed ceilings with a brick and stone, native stone and brick structure. Yeah. And the walls are about 4 to 5 feet thick. They're really thick. And it looks like the guns could actually have stuck out windows. So they called it the bomb-proof barracks. And recently, there was an Army historian on the island within the last couple of weeks associated with the Naval War College. And he said, although I've seen references that this was designated a naval magazine, that really makes more sense than a barracks. He said, because this is way overbuilt for people. There's no way they would have put soldiers in a room with 9-foot ceilings and 4-foot thick walls. It was probably built to store the gun cotton that they used in the early mines and torpedoes. Okay. And then later repurposed as a barrack. So where the term barracks came, because we think of a barracks as a personnel place, is really unknown. It might be in the archives, the National Archives, and we hope to do a little bit more research on that. I have 5 interns this summer on Rose Island from Salva University, 2 of which will be working on historical preservation. So we're going to do a little digging to see if we can find out.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. I've certainly never seen any place that looks like it. And it's interesting you brought that up, because I've wondered that when I've been in some of those rooms and thought, these are awfully big, for listed men to live in. It didn't seem, it seemed extremely unusual. But those dome ceilings you're talking about in those rooms are pretty spectacular, beautifully built.
Yeah, that cantilevered arches. I had another architect on the island, historical architect, brilliant woman who actually lives locally but works internationally. And she said, these are called cantilevered arches. And these are in amazing condition, she said. They're just amazing. The beauty of them. You got to remember, 1798, everything had to be built by hand. Yeah. And these are perfectly formed arches in four cardinal directions with a keystone in the middle. So, it had to be some coordinated engineering to make it happen.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there was some amazing building that went on. Yep. It's hard to believe with the technology they had, what they could do at that time. Let's talk about the lighthouse, of course. This is a podcast about lighthouses, so yes. We should talk about that, although there'd be plenty to talk about even without that. But let's talk about the human history of the lighthouse a little bit. It was a family station. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was always a single keeper living there with his family. I think pretty much through the entire history of that lighthouse.
There were 10 keepers between 1869 or 1870 and 1939. In 1939, the U.S. Coast Guard took over. So at that point, it became more of a barracks for the Coast Guardmen that were stationed there. Right. But there were 10 keepers that were, as you say, family men who stayed there. Many were Civil War veterans. The first assistant keeper that I'm aware of is Jules Johansen, who came in 1912. Okay. And that was the year that the foghorn, the steam-generated foghorn was added. That brick building in front of the lighthouse is the foghorn building. It housed the apparatus and it housed the foghorn that was built on Rose Island. Jules Johansen was an assistant. And as I understand it, there was a keeper and an assistant keeper. The assistant keeper's job was to maintain the foghorn. Interesting story. I did a little research recently and put two and two together. In 1894, there was a grounding of a Fall River Line ship on the rocks in front of the lighthouse. The fellow's name was the captain was Elijah Danger Davis, and the fog eater they called the fog eater. So he ran aground in the fog. Now in 1894. There was no way to warn mariners of the fog or the rocks. Mm-hmm. In 1895, the fog bell, there was a mechanical fog bell added so a year after it went aground, they put the bell up. But it wasn't until 1912 that Johansen came to the island and he became the first assistant keeper. I met his granddaughter last summer. Not last summer, 2019, 2020 we lost. But 2019, this lady came up and introduced herself as Ms. Johansen. And she said, my grandfather, it might have been a great-grandfather, was stationed here. Tragically, he died in a boating accident coming to the lighthouse. He drowned, fell off. It was cold weather. He probably fell in the ocean and drowned. Interesting story, how it rounds about,
Yeah. That's really interesting to know. And I often say when I lecture and tell people about, lighthouse stories, human stories, that, it's not as romantic as people think, lighthouse keeping in general. And if you delve into the history of almost any offshore lighthouse, whether it's on an island or on a rock or whatever, if you're talking at least a mile or two or more off the coast, you're going to find at least one or more tragedies in there in the history somewhere. So it's not unusual.
These men and women were tough. I mean, we have no idea how easy we have it today compared to their life with off the grid, no fresh water on that island. They had to collect rainwater. Everything that came to the island, they had to bring it by launch 365 days of the year.
Yeah.
So, it was a tough life.
It was, I think, rewarding in a lot of ways, but there's no doubt that it was extremely tough and you had to be a certain kind of person to do that job for any length of time. Right. Are there any other particular stories of the keepers and families who lived there over the years that really stand out for you?
Well, obviously the Curtis family, they were the keepers. Charles Curtis was the keeper between 1887 and 1917, just prior to World War I. Again, he was a Civil War veteran. The story I like to tell is that his appointment is framed in our lighthouse. And he was appointed in 1887 at an annual salary of $500 per year. And I always show that to the people that come into the lighthouse because we can't relate. $500 annually was his salary.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, across the bay from Rose Island is the Ida Lewis Lighthouse, and known as the Ida Lewis Lighthouse. It sits on Lime Rock. It's a harbor light in Newport Harbor on the interior of the harbor.
Yeah.
And Ida Lewis is, I won't go into the whole story, but the short of it is that she took over as the lightkeeper at that lighthouse when her father had a stroke, and is credited quite an amazing woman of her time, very strong rower, strong swimmer, saved over 18 people in the course of her term as the lightkeeper. So she was pretty famous for her day.
She was. Yeah.
And her salary was $750 a year. So she made more money than Curtis.
Yeah. Actually, she for a period was the highest paid lighthouse keeper in the country.
That's correct.
Yeah,
correct.
Which is incredible when you think that today women are still fighting for equal pay for equal jobs.
There you go. Back then, she was ahead of her time, right?
She was. I think in a lot of ways. She was
and
really
I think she was appointed permanent lightkeeper by Burnside, William Burnside, who was the governor of Rhode Island and a pretty famous Civil War general.
Yeah, I think it was his advocacy that led her to getting the title of keeper. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ida Lewis may be the most famous lighthouse keeper in American history. And actually, I interviewed Lenore Scommel, who wrote a great book about Ida Lewis. Interviewed her for this podcast. The book was Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. And if people want to read more about Ida, that's a great one to check out.
Right. But get back to Curtis, because you asked me, the question you asked me was about stories about so that was one little story. The other story is that Curtis was instrumental in our present history as well, because his grandson, Wanton Chase, lived on Rose Island with him as a result of having had very poor health as a child. So Curtis's extended family lived in Newport. His daughter had 3 boys or 3 children. I'm not sure they were all boys, but 3 children. Wanton was the youngest. And he had very poor health. They didn't quite know at the time. Turned out, I think he was born with only a single lung or something to that effect. Anyways, he suffered poor health as a child. And Grandma Curtis convinced Mom to allow Wanton to live on Rose Island with them in the period of, say, 1912 to, say, 1917, 5 or 6 years. Yep. He was probably 5 or 6 years old at the time, and he lived with his grandparents on Rose Island during that period of time. And so fast forward to the 1980s, when this citizen startup group formed to save the lighthouse. Let's save the lighthouse. And I think Charlotte was involved in that, Charlotte Johnson, and several other instrumental people in the city of Newport that wanted to save this lighthouse from demolition. And they established an office in Newport. And one day this old fellow comes to the office and said, "Hey, I understand you're restoring the Rose Island Lighthouse." He said, "Would you like some help?" Turned out that fellow was Wanton Chase, the grandson of Charles Curtis. Yeah. And so the lighthouse today that we have is built to look as it did in 1912 to 1918 when Wanton Chase lived there as a child.
I actually have a story related to that you might have heard, but I'll tell it in case you might not have heard it. And for our listeners, probably haven't heard this. But I know that period when you're talking about, when the lighthouse was restored to the period when Wanton Chase lived there as a boy. I heard that when he first visited there and stepped into the kitchen that was all restored, Charlotte Johnson, who you mentioned, was the director at that time. And he said something to her like, "Oh, I can just smell my grandmother's cookies baking in the oven."
Yep.
And, that shows how great the restoration was. But after that, people kind of picked up that statement, and they thought that he was saying that the ghost of his grandmother was there, that it was haunted by the ghost of his grandmother. So I don't know if you know about that kind of got twisted over the years.
Yes, this came up when we had that paranormal show that came with Amos, Andy, and Amy and Andy. I think, I'm not sure if it was ghosts. It's escaping me. I apologize.
That's
okay. But there was a medium that came with them that said, "I'm feeling the presence of a person with the initials CC." And that would be Christina Curtis, who was...
Could be Charles Curtis.
Well, could be Charles Curtis too, but his wife's name was Christina, so they were both CC. Could have been both. But that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. Maybe we'll touch on that subject a little bit more before we're done. But talking about Wanton Chase, in recent years, there's been 2 children's books about the keepers and families on Rose Island. He and his grandfather were the subjects of one of them. But then there was another one. Could you say a little bit about those books?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first one of our local authors here in Rhode Island, Lynn Heinsman, worked with the prior director to establish this idea of creating a book or a book series that would have some of the history of Rose Island Lighthouse told. And so the first one in the series of books was called The Curious Childhood of Wanton Chase. And it basically told the story that I just referred to you as, and many, many other things about what the island and life was like on Rose Island during the period of time when Wanton Chase lived there. Yep. Very successful, beautiful book, well illustrated, well written. And it kind of looks like a children's book, but it's really not. It's an adult and children's book. And there's a tremendous amount of history and information about what life was like during the period when they lived there, 1900 to 1917. So it's certainly a different world than we live today. I mean, they had, no indoor plumbing. Their only source of heat was that wooden coal stove that you mentioned in the kitchen. They drank the rainwater, basically. They grew gardens and had farm animals, and it was a difficult life. Yeah. And then there was a second book recently written. We're having a book signing on June 5th with the author on Rose Island. It's called The Island Adventures of Paul Stedman. Now, Paul Stedman was the grandson of Jesse Orton, who was the keeper at Rose Island from 1924 to 1936, I think, something like that. Paul was the grandson of Jesse, and he lived there for a period of time with his grandpa and experienced life on Rose Island. So he had, and that was across the years leading up to World War II, because leading up to, as I mentioned, the Coast Guard took over in 1939. Well, we were engaged in World War II at that point, and Rose Island became heavily militarized with guns and coastal artillery. So it was an interesting period of buildup at that time. So yeah, his stories are quite interesting as well.
There's a photo I love of Paul Stedman with his grandfather, Jesse Orton. I'm sure you know the photo I'm talking about. It's like a studio portrait of the two of them.
In uniform?
Like a dress uniform, with Paul when he was a kid.
The official book release has just occurred, or will just occur. We've kind of seen pre-copies of it, but it will be available to the public soon. And as I say, on June 5th on Rose Island, if anyone is local and would like to come, we'd love to have you. Yeah. Lynn will be speaking, and we'll be giving tours. It'll be quite a fun day to release this book and sort of celebrate the grand opening, the summer opening of Rose Island Lighthouse again.
Right. I should mention that we're speaking on, what's today, May 19th, 20th? What is today?
20th today. May 20th.
May 20th. Today's May 20th. But people will be hearing this later. So they'll also be hearing it, I believe, after the event that you're talking about. But that by the time people hear it, that book should be available.
Should be available, absolutely. Yeah. Woodhall Press is the publisher.
Let's talk about the restoration of the lighthouse. I know that's before your time there personally. I first saw Rose Island Lighthouse in 1989. It would have been August of 1989, because that was the 200th anniversary of the original lighthouse establishment, the Lighthouse Service in the United States, founded on August 7th, 1789 by Act of Congress. So there was a big 200th celebration the U.S. Lighthouse Society put on in Newport that year. And I was there for that with my wife. It was cut short because of a hurricane. So there were only a couple of days instead of a few days that were planned. But anyway, I was driving across the Newport Bridge, or I guess the official name is the Claiborne-Pell Bridge. Is that correct?
Pell Bridge, yep.
Yeah. And you see the lighthouse from the bridge, a bit distantly, but clearly. And I remember looking at it and seeing that it was all boarded up and looked like it was kind of a ghost of a lighthouse. But the restoration got going not that many years later. And again, I know it's before your time. Can you just tell a bit of that story of how the lighthouse was saved?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my first experience with the lighthouse was 1987. I went to the island professionally as a biologist to do a survey of Canada geese. Okay. So at that time in 87, there was no vegetation. It was grass. You could walk from one end of the island to the other uninhibited. Yeah, without any problems at all. Yeah. And the lighthouse, as you mentioned, was boarded up. Officially, the Rose Island Lighthouse Foundation came into being officially in 1985, but I don't think it was until a year later until they actually began the work on the site, because they took a lot of startup. They received over $500,000 in donated labor and services and raised an additional amount of money. The figure I saw was $1.2 million spent on that place to restore it to the condition that you see it today.
Yeah.
And it took them between 1986 and 1993 on National Lighthouse Day, August 7th, 1993. The official lighthouse was opened and restored to the public as a completed lighthouse. It was actually relit on that day as a private aid to navigation. So we are a private aid. We are an operational lighthouse with a functioning beacon. We have a Fresnel lens that flashes white every 6 seconds.
Yeah.
But, it was an arduous project. I know one funny story that came out of it. Prior to the foundation coming into being, the lighthouse was heavily vandalized. So between the period of 1970, when it was decommissioned, and 1985, when the foundation came into existence, it became kind of a party spot. So it was vandalized. It was pilfered. There was a lot of, stolen items out of there. And then once it was opened up, the wildlife moved in. So it was basically pigeons and gulls were living in the building, and it was basically ready for demolition. Yeah. And so that group saved it. The structure, the bones of the building was strong. It was gutted inside, stripped outside, and then refurbished completely from the ground up. It was really a labor of love. I mean, Charlotte and her group, Curtis Bunting, I know, was a name that comes to mind that was involved in it, and many other people who I don't want to slight if they're still listening, that were instrumental. It was a real community effort. So sure. What I've inherited is quite a beautiful building that is itself on the National Register of Historical Places.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I was so pleased, as I know many people were, to see that lighthouse come back from the dead, basically. I mean, it was so far gone, and it's so beautiful. I know there's been several restorations since then, kind of phases of restoration. It's in fantastic.
And in those days, Jeremy, we owned only the 1.5 acres. There's 2 lots on Rose Island. 1.5 acres is where the lighthouse sits. And the remaining property, which is about 16 and a half acres, was owned by private developers. In that era, we were concerned about the developers. They were looking at building condos and a marina and all this kind of fancy stuff. And the foundation was instrumental in kind of holding that off, adhering. And eventually they relented, and we successfully received a grant from the state of Rhode Island to purchase the rest of the property. And the reason why, this is where I was going to go before you asked me about the ecology. Rose Island was unique in that the vegetation was special to a group of birds called colony nesting wading birds. So these are birds that we traditionally think of as herons and egrets, ibis, herons, and egrets. And they like to nest in groups on uninhabited islands. It certainly turns out that Rose Island had the correct configuration and structure of habitat to attract these birds. And so being a threatened resource, that was instrumental in the state giving us the grant to purchase the island and save the habitat. So to this day, during the period of April 1 to August 15th, the interior of the island is off limits to humans. We observe this nesting period refrain of any human activity back there. So these birds can, and we've had as many, like last summer, we had 100 ibis nesting on the island. Wow. Great egrets. At the peak of great egrets, there was probably 80 nests on the island. It's quite impressive, the biological productivity of these animals. So yeah, so we're fortunate to have that. And that was the reason we got the grant. We were able to purchase the entire island. So it is protected as a wildlife refuge. It's known as the Rose Island Wildlife Refuge. Right. Protected in perpetuity. It will never be developed.
Yeah. I've also seen American oyster catchers there, which are not real common.
Yes. Well, that's a shorebird. We have those too. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's a fantastic place just for wildlife alone. Never mind the lighthouse, but the lighthouse is great too. Yep. So let's talk about what is there for visitors. First of all, you mentioned the boat that belongs to the organization, but how do visitors typically get to and from the island?
So day visitors, there is a ferry service that runs the harbor of Newport. It stops at Fort Adams and Thames Street and Parati Park and Rose Island. So it makes a loop around the harbor every hour. And so a lot of visitors come on the ferry by it's called a hop on, hop off ferry. They can jump on the ferry for a small fee and come to the Rose Island, spend a day there. Yeah. If you're a member, we do have a landing fee. So people pay a landing fee or an admission fee to come to the island, to look around at the place and to go into the lighthouse. So that's how most people get there. We also have a lot of people that come on kayaks. They come in private boats. We don't have a lot of dock space. So usually they pull up on the beach or they anchor and then swim in or take a little dinghy in or something like that. Yeah. But it's popular. I mean, we usually have anywhere between 2,500 and 3,000 visitors come just on the day visits. They spend anywhere from an hour to the day there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
between 10 and 4 p.m.
When I visited there in the past, at least 2 or 3 times, I went from the Jamestown side to the ferry from the Jamestown side. Does that still run from there as well?
That's where the ferry disembarks from Jamestown, East Ferry in Jamestown, and it goes to Fort Adams, and again makes that circle
Right.
around the inner harbor. So it goes from Fort Adams to Ann Street Pier on Thames Street to Parati Park to Rose Island to Jamestown. It keeps circling in that direction.
It's made that same circle for many years, I believe.
Many years, yeah. It's very popular. They have several ferries that service. We generally are serviced by the Catherine, and it's pretty popular. You can actually buy your ticket right on the ferry, which is a good thing for us.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. No, I've enjoyed a number of rides on that ferry over the years.
Yep.
So let's talk about the building itself. You mentioned it's been restored. It's restored to what era again? What years are we talking about? World War I era.
To the period of 1900 to 1912, something in that period of time.
Which fits in with the childhood of Wanton Chase, who you were talking about. But one of the really neat features of the restoration, the stuff that's been done in fairly recent years, was the installation of a replica 6th order Fresnel lens.
Yes.
And another guest I've had on the podcast was Dan Spinella of Artworks Florida, who actually is the one who creates those replica lenses. Right. And it's mind-blowing, the work he does. You cannot, anybody who doesn't know, even people who are really familiar with Fresnel lenses would not know that's a replica lens. It's really, really beautiful. Are people surprised when they see that and you tell them that's not glass, that's actually a replica?
Yeah, I most people are completely clueless when they look at that. So I mean, I sometimes I don't even mention it, unless they ask me. It's a 6th order Fresnel lens. If they press, I will say it's a replica.
Mm-hmm.
It is a beautiful piece of work. There's no question about it. I mean, I lament the fact that we don't have the original, but the original Fresnel, I've asked Charlotte and others where it went to, and I've gotten varying answers. I figured it might have been taken out by the Coast Guard, but Charlotte theorizes it might have been just vandalized and thrown into Narragansett Bay, which
that's
would be
very possible.
A tragic thing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of them were, before people knew better, a lot of them were just kind of trashed, but luckily a lot of them were saved.
But ours is beautiful. I mean, it's a work of art, and the pedestal, the lens itself, very functional and bright, and it does the job. It's beautiful.
It really is. So you mentioned day trips. People can visit the lighthouse as day visitors. When they do that, if they take the ferry and get off at the island, are there tours available?
There are tours available. We do a couple of different things. So we are a small staff. In the summertime, we do have summer help on the dock, and they do provide, upon request, simple tours for guests that come on the island. We also have a brochure with a self-guided tour that if you follow along, you can see different stations and understand how the lighthouse worked. We do offer private tours as well, which tend to disembark from Newport Harbor for small groups of up to 6 individuals. And then we will be offering during the summer tour guided tours, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, which are a little bit more elaborate to talk about both the lighthouse and Fort Hamilton. So there's a variety of options there.
Well, of course, one of the great things at Rose Island that I think if people know about it, lighthouse buffs know about it, this is probably what they think of first, the fact that there are overnight accommodations there at the lighthouse and actually in the fort as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's really what makes us survive, because it's very popular and people come and stay in the lighthouse, and that provides us with some cash flow to keep our site maintained and everything going strong. But we have 5 different rooms that are available, 3 in the lighthouse and 1 in the Foghorn building and 1 in the Fort Hamilton barracks. And so in the second floor, we have the premium facility, which is a full apartment with full accommodations. It's called the Keeper's Apartment. And then downstairs in the museum, we have 2 smaller bedrooms, which are appropriate for a couple, but there aren't a lot of amenities that go along with that. Foghorn room, similar, and the Fort Hamilton barracks, again, a bed. I like to say we're a bed and breakfast. We offer you the bed, but no breakfast. So you bring your own breakfast. Compared to some of the other facilities, that's one thing that we don't do. We encourage people, they have to bring their own food. Sure. We provide the linens, we provide the comfort, we provide the room. But most people bring, if they're staying overnight, obviously they bring their own food. It's very popular. It's extremely laid back. And the people that come there rave about the accommodation. So it's a nice thing.
I've stayed in the upstairs apartment twice. Waking up on that island is a pretty special thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's there isn't a bad view. Every window has a spectacular view. Some people, when they first go in, say, "Well, because we don't have a lot of curtains on the windows, because we like the light coming in there," and nobody complains about that. They like that once they've been there. And the constant crashing. This is right on the water's edge, so there's a lot of beautiful sounds of the waves and wind and the birds as well. So it's good. I might mention the keeper's apartment is pretty full. It's got a fully modern kitchen. We've just renovated the entire upstairs, new floors, new kitchen, new bathroom. It's pretty premium at this point in time. With the advent of COVID, we were commingling people in the house, but out of an abundance of caution, we have slowed on rentals of the downstairs rooms for public safety. It remains to be seen whether we will go back to that. We're still evaluating, and things are changing very quickly. But so for this summer, we're primarily renting the keeper's apartment, the Foghorn building, and the Fort Hamilton Barracks. The Fort Hamilton Barracks is extremely charming and comfortable, and people really love that spot. It's kind of off the grid a little bit as far as being away from the water, away from the lighthouse. So it's a family spot.
Talk about being on the water. That Foghorn building is pretty incredible. That's a beautiful room in there. I love that.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful room. It's right at water's edge. At high tide, the waves are lapping at the windows.
Yeah, I actually spent a night there.
Yeah,
that was
nice.
That was really cool. I love the brick walls. Just the whole feel of that room is great. Are there minimum stays?
We're evaluating that. I mean, we were moving in that direction when the pandemic affected us in 2020. We had a backlog of reservations, and fortunately, many of the guests, it's so difficult to get a place that they held their reservation over. And so, for this summer, we're allowing one night stays. So we had a lot of gaps of just one night, but I think we may be moving in the direction of a minimum stay of at least 2 nights. As you know, when you go to the island, it's not a hotel, it's an experience. We are really not a hotel. We're not selling a hotel experience. We're selling a keeper's experience. You want people to see what it was like to live in a 19th-century lighthouse built in 1870.
Yeah.
And you can't really experience that if you pop in at 6 and leave at 10 the next morning. So we're trying to encourage people to stay a couple of nights and experience that. So. And a lot of people are looking for that, so that's a positive thing.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me. So how far in advance are those rooms typically booked?
We have some availability now, but many times they're booked at least a year in advance.
Right.
If you want the choice of date, then you book a year in advance.
Yeah.
At this time, we have not opened 2022. We're pretty well solid booked through 2021. We do have some availability in our outbuildings. Interior of the lighthouse, we're pretty solid right through. I mean, there are cancellations, so we have a wait list if someone is interested. But as far as the Foghorn room and the Fort Hamilton Barracks, there is some availability in those 2 rooms. And our season, I didn't mention, we used to be, when you came there, we were open year round.
Right.
But it's a difficult environment out there in the wintertime between the ice and the snow and if someone gets stranded there and we can't get the boat out, you really have an issue. So a lot of our guests are older folks, and we just the worry of all of the parameters coming together in a perfect storm. We didn't want that to happen. So we established a season from April 1 to November 1. That is our booking season.
I was surprised, actually, it was able to stay open year round before.
Yeah.
But it makes sense.
Well, like I say, there's a couple of issues there. The house is heated today modernly with oil heat. Yeah. And when the lighthouse was originally designed, they put twin 300-gallon tanks of oil in the basement. The problem is filling those. Today, you can't get a barge to come and deliver oil to the house. So for a couple of winters, we were hand carrying fuel to the it's like feeding a farm animal. And I said, this is just not going to work for us, especially when there's nobody in the house, so pipes damage and things like that. So we winterize the plumbing and we go from there.
So I know that years ago, the stays in the upstairs apartment were usually a week, and people were expected to do certain chores like recording the weather, mowing the lawn, helping to give tours, et cetera, et cetera. Does anything like that is that part of the experience now or not?
We still allow people, those that can and are willing to do chores will do it. We don't have the same program. They had a keepers week where someone would stay for a week and basically run the lighthouse for a week. But the number of people that are able to do that is just broad gaps. So, the property manager's job is to take care of that stuff. And, guests that are willing to paint, or we do have some of those that are really avid people, and, they take care of the flag and they do some, trimming and things like that. But generally speaking, we don't have that experience as it was before.
I remember being there one time when a family that had been there for a week was just leaving. I saw them getting their stuff together and leaving, and they were just, all of them looked like they were just about in tears.
Yeah.
Leaving the place. I'm sure you get a lot of that.
We have several families that are traditional week stayers, and they stay for an entire week, and it's a special place for them. I mean, there's no question about it. They love it.
It's hard to.
I'd like to have a week to stay out there all the time by myself. That'd be great.
I'll bet you would.
I don't.
Yeah, you're probably working pretty much all the time when you're there.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Now, education is a big component of what the organization offers there. Do you have a lot of school groups visit?
We have in the past. And, if you take 2020 out of the equation, in 2019, we were doing okay. We had an education director for quite a few years who had established a relationship with several communities. And so we were very active in that area. Unfortunately, budgets being what they are, many of the schools can no longer afford to travel extensively because it's a logistical issue with the ferry to get the kids over there and things like that. So we're exploring new ways to encourage visitation by local school groups that would maybe not be so costly. Some of our fundraising is dedicated toward that thing to help offset the cost of the camp or the cost of the school visit and that type of thing. So after we lost 2020, we're trying to get back to that point again. We no longer have an education director, so that's a bit of a challenge as well. So we're a pretty small staff, and we are trying to just recover from 2020 and then hopefully move forward with some new programs.
Are the offices still at the Armory building in Newport?
No, we've moved. So we are now situated in an office at the Newport Shipyard. The Newport Shipyard is where we keep starfish. It's a 32-foot boat, so you just don't park it anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so the city who owned the Armory restored that into a different kind of use. It's a transient boater facility right now. So we lost our space there and had to find additional in a different location. So we do have a small office at Newport Shipyard, and we keep our boat there. So that's our center of operation.
Oh, okay. I wasn't quite sure about that. So I understand you also offer harbor tours. I imagine those are on the Starfish, the boat you just talked about?
On the Starfish, yes. Those are wonderful tours that leave from either Fort Adams or the shipyard, and they're about 2 hours. And we take them, tell them some of the history of Newport Harbor, and take them to Rose Island for a private tour of the lighthouse and the Fort Hamilton area. They're quite popular. We did even in the pandemic, I think we did 25 or 30 of those last summer. It was pretty good.
Wow.
A lot of people are looking for that private experience, and you could do a lot more with folks in that smaller, more intimate group. So it's a fun time.
Yeah. How many people does it take?
We take 6 on a tour.
Yeah. Well, that's a great opportunity for people visiting the area.
One other aspect of our tours is the cruise ship season. So Newport is a favorite stop for the cruise ships that disembark from New York City. They usually stop in Newport and Portland and Bar Harbor and, Halifax and different places like that. And pandemic just slammed that door shut. So that we were receiving probably 1,100 to 1,200 visitors from the cruise ships that were coming. And those people were from all over the world. Yeah. So that was an interesting thing. We didn't get anything last summer, and the cruise industry has been shut down. And we're hoping to see that component come back, because a lot of those folks, like you say, they're, ex-military, they can really relate to the history of Rose Island. It's a very popular tour on their stop.
But let me ask you right now, is there anything else like really important you like to tell people that we haven't already touched on about Rose Island?
The thing that I tell people is it is a hidden jewel in Newport. If you come to Newport and you want to learn a lot about the history of Newport as it relates to the islands and the landscape around it, come to Rose Island. We are a nice change of pace from the hustle and bustle of the city and the trinket shops and the restaurants. If you want to come out and learn a little bit more about what Rose Island or what Newport was like at those times, you can come to Rose Island. So that's usually it's definitely a jewel. There's no question about it. As you know, you've been there. So, I mean, it's a jewel in the harbor, and we have an awful lot to offer.
I refer to it that way a lot myself, a jewel of Narragansett Bay.
Yep, absolutely.
That's maybe a term that's thrown around for things, maybe too much, but in this case, it's really, really fitting.
Sure.
It really is a jewel. I have one final question for you for bonus points. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What has been your favorite part personally of your work with Rose Island?
Really, the history. I love the history. I mean, I spent my life as a scientist studying facts and figures, but I like to memorize facts and learn about things. So this has been, to know that this stuff occurred. It's always fascinating to me to think about the ancestors that we had that lived on these places. We go about our daily lives and, we just see what happens right in front of us. But if you stop and think of it, especially when you go to a place like Rose Island that has these old structures there, you think about the men and women that came and went and lived their lives out in those places. It blows your mind what really happened there. And, nothing, it's cumulative in terms of, nothing. There were some spectacular events there, I'm sure, but most of it's just life. It's just living life, 200 years ago, what it was like. And every day that I go there and, I think about I walk around and I touch these things and I think about the people that lived and worked there through history, and it just gives you chills sometimes. Maybe that's the connection with the ghosts that were there, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
People that lived their lives there. And, now I'm part of it. I'm a keeper just like those guys were. I keep the lighthouse. That's my job, so
Yeah.
it's fun to be part of that. You understand.
I do understand. I couldn't understand more, but you have a really special place to work at there. Brian Tefft, I want to thank you so much. It's all fascinating and interesting and fun. It's just an amazing place. It is a jewel.
Well, Jeremy, my pleasure in helping you out. I really enjoyed talking with you today. It was a blast. Tell your listeners to come visit us at Rose Island. We'd like to see you.
For more on Rose Island Lighthouse, check out roseisland.org.
As I mentioned in the interview, the first time I saw Rose Island was in the late 80s, and I've been there many times since then. It's a very special place, and the fact that the lighthouse was restored and the island was saved from developers is a great thing. I know some of our listeners are looking for lighthouses where they can stay overnight, and Rose Island would be at the top of my recommendations.
I'll have to get out there sometime. It sounds beautiful.
You should, yeah, it's great.
Check out uslhs.org to read about the tours, the research catalog, and everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers. Donations and memberships help support this podcast.
This Wednesday, July 7th, there will be a special edition of Lighthearted featuring Noel Lynch, a tour guide at Hook Lighthouse in Ireland, which is the oldest operating lighthouse in the world. And in addition to the usual audio version of the podcast, I'll be posting a video version. Noel actually takes us on a tour of the buildings at Hook Lighthouse in the video. Watch for that this Wednesday on the USLHS news blog at news.uslhs.org.
Next Sunday, episode 127, will feature an interview with April Havens, site manager for Piney Point Lighthouse in Maryland.
And it'll also feature an interview with Lee Radzak, a longtime manager, caretaker of Split Rock Lighthouse in Minnesota, has a brand new book that's a really beautiful book, so I'll be talking to him about that too. So to everyone out there who's involved with the preservation of lighthouses and other historic sites, thanks for everything you do. We are all on the same team.
The American musician Jan Berry of Jan and Dean once said, and I quote, "When the darkness comes, keep an eye on the light. Whatever that is for you, no matter how far away it seems." End quote.
I'm going to ask our guest announcers, Bob and Sherry Schock, to help me out again. Wishing you all a very happy 4th of July. As always, thanks for listening and
Keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.